Um, Maybe we could start with a quick round of introductions while everyone else joins. Um, I'm Ayushi, and I work with Agami. The question I'm holding right now is how do you design codes from scratch such that they are more citizen centric? Simi, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm Simi. I also work with Agami. The question that I'm holding now is really what are interesting ways for different um, legal services to be interoperable in a useful way? I think that's something that I'm exploring now. I'll tag Anushka.
Hi, I'm Anushka Ashok. I'm a behavior science lead at Finalmile. And the problem I'm grappling with is that the queue is just designing systems that people inherently trust and therefore engage with, specifically around vaccines right now. Supriya?
Hi, everybody. I'm Supriya from Agami. And I think where I'm coming from is we are doing a lot of work right now, potentially with the courts, where we're trying to design what the dispute resolution process looks like. And there's just so much you can imagine and is possible. And like how do you either design what you do and how you do it in a way. I mean, we talk about it as user adoption, but I think the word trust in this evoked questions in me to kind of say like, okay, what does, even if I adopt it, like how much do I trust it? Because then it's beyond something that I have to do. So that's really why I'm here. And I'll tag Khushbu.
Hi everyone, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, great. My name is Khushbu. I am a research associate at JPAD, and yeah, I'm excited to hear what we have for this learning session. I will tag Mohit.
Hello, my name is Mohit. Hi everyone. I'm a lawyer and entrepreneur. The challenge the thing that I'm facing, or the question that I'm facing is how do we create more trust in mediation, which has I think been a challenge for a bit. I would like to tag Suman ma'am. Do you, yeah.
Hi, I hope I'm audible. I'm Suman. I teach law in Mumbai. And I think the question that I feel is one is how a trust actually in mediation, and actually how do we convince parties that it is the appropriate way? And then, of course, on the use of technology and how that trust can be built. And I'll tag Madhav.
Hey, hi.
We can hear you, Madhav.
Hi. Sorry, I just joined and I'm a little lost. I don't know what I've been tagged
Ah,
for. So I feel like a deer caught in the headlights. So
you just have to introduce yourselves and share anything that came to your mind when you thought about trust, anything that you want to build trust in.
yeah, sure. So I'm Madhav and I work for a company called Just Act. We are an online dispute resolution platform based out of Chennai. Trust, you said, right?
Yes.
Trust, I think, is something that you need to build on, and it just and people end up misusing it most of the time. As my personal experience and also experience from others around me, and most easily, traded commodity in any space. So that's where I think I have. Uh, I mean, my ideas are. I would stop there for now.
Thank you, Madhav. Avanti, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thanks, Ayushi. Hi, everyone. I'm Avanti, working with a legal startup called Setu on democratizing legal information. We're very initial in our work currently, but trust for us, I think, is more from reducing the trust deficit that probably exists between people and the legal system. and how can we be part of that process? So that's where we're coming from. I don't know who's gone yet, but I'm just seeing Chitra in the list. Would you like to go, or you can let me know who else I can tag?
Sure, I will. Thank you. I'm Chitra. I'm a mediator, a law teacher, nothing on trust just now because I'm captivated by a peacock nearby, which has climbed onto a terrace in a densely residential neighborhood, and there are crows hassling it. So sorry, not able to think through the points that you've asked. But
Thank you,
thanks for organizing this.
That's so beautiful. I'm at the airport and I wish I could see a peacock here too. Aditi, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi everyone, I'm Aditi. I'm also coming from a place of trying to build tech for the citizens. So in right now working on dispute resolution, but otherwise building a lot of tech or building a lot of products for citizens, either in education, in healthcare, and agriculture. So I think trust for me, when it's coming from institutions like the judiciary or even governments, what does it take implicitly for tech to build trust or tech to feel reliable for a user without a lot of verbal communication or without a lot of top-down enforcement? How do you build that trust in users so that they inherently use it?
Maybe I'll tag someone. Kanchan?
Yeah, hi, Yoshi. Sorry, I joined in a couple of minutes late, so I may need a quick recap to
Just
answer
have
or
to introduce
chip in into
yourself
the.
and what comes to your mind when you think about trust.
I think trust in the dispute resolution space goes hand in hand, if you ask me honestly, with fairness and transparency. You know, where in the space that we operate, people will trust your system if it is transparent and your process, and they will trust it if they feel it is fair, which is slightly esoteric because, you know, when things don't go your way, you might think they're unfair. So therefore, the transparency should also make up for that. And a subset of that transparency, I would also add as communication. You know, lack of sufficient communication, you know, keeps people in the dark. So they are like, okay, what is happening? So I don't know whether this is going right, not going right. So there are a lot of question marks. The moment there is sufficient communication going out, there is sufficient communication happening on what is happening and what is meant to happen, and you know, all of those things, I believe that that also puts at rest many questions they might have regarding trusting the process.
Thanks, Kanchan. Maybe I'll tag Sai next. And maybe if we could, since we're already at 5:40, if we could take, if you could answer in one line. Sai?
Hey, I'm Sai. I'm actually from Team Agami. I think, I'm honestly excited to listen in on this call, but trust for me is also transparency and open communication.
Thanks, Sai. Sorry, I didn't give that one-line briefing before. But Ajitesh, would you like to go next? You're on mute, Ajitesh.
Hi, hello. Sorry,
Hi.
I missed the track. Actually, I was on a call.
No worries. Just want to, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. This is Ajitesh. I work with Sama. Currently working with the Smart ODR team, and yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ajitesh. Mayank, would you like to go next?
Hi, yeah, sorry. Hi, my name is Mayank. I am an advocate and a mediator in Delhi. For me, trust actually, in relation to ODR, is mostly all about how, even if you come to a conclusion, does it get recorded and how it is enforced? Like, how people do, how the solution actually comes about, because people have a lot of issues in actually enforcing even the agreement that they have reached. So how to fill that trust deficit, I think, is more important than even reaching the agreement in the first place.
Thank you. Pranav?
Hi everyone. Yeah, so I'm an associate with a law firm. I'm just very interested in how our laws are designed in a way that we just kind of represent the complete lack of trust that the government has in businesses. And I'm interested in kind of exploring that a little further.
Thank you. Sampanna?
Hi everyone. I'm actually currently working as a product specialist for a startup which is trying to automate due diligence for property investment in India. And I think just because property title ownership is so presumptive, there is a trust deficit with respect to whether a property is good enough to be invested or not. So I just wanted to kind of see whether this session holds any relevance, and also the fact that I made good friends with Anushka at the time when I met her in Agami Summit. We were there in the same group. So looking forward to the session.
Sampanna. Brinda? You're muted, Brinda.
Hey, hi. Sorry, I couldn't hear my name clearly. Hi, it's good to know. I think I have few of my ex-teachers on this call, Suman ma'am, and I think Chitra ma'am. Hey, this is Brinda here. I work with eGovernment's Foundation. I manage their data privacy and data protection policy work. And for me, this conversation is really interesting because we try to understand how to build trust, to make sure that citizens trust the systems they use. And I'm excited to hear from everyone, their perspectives in different sectors. Thanks.
That's so interesting. Thanks, Brinda. Deepa?
Hi, everyone. My name is Deepa. I am a anthropologist and law professor. I'm based in the US at Emory, but I'm here on a Fulbright grant doing some research, and I've been hanging out a bit with the folks at Agami, and Sai invited me to join this call. My research is a little bit perpendicular to all of this, but because I'm in academia, I think about trust mostly in the sense of how we can convince people that they actually know something when we convey it to them. So the issues of trust that come along with expertise and conveying expertise.
Thank you. Mithali?
Hi everyone. My name is Mithali. I'm a public servant and very, very interested in behavior. So we deal with agriculture and training. So it's at the intersection of a lot of what we do.
Thank you. Subhaya?
Hi, everybody. I work with Carder, ODR. I think trust is one of the basic steps for adoption for any product or any new channel that comes in. So trying to see how we can make that better.
Thank you. Is there anyone who's left to go?
Hi, I'm Dr. Pratima Narayan. Hi, all.
Hi.
Yeah. Hi. I'm a lawyer, a law teacher, and an ODR enthusiast. And I'm looking forward to know more about building trust using as and when we use more of technology in the dispute resolution space, as we innovate more in the dispute resolution space. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for joining. Welcome to the PUCAR Learning Circle 6. As you know, sorry, that's a gate change announcement behind me. I'm at the airport. But as you know, the Learning Circle is a space for us to meet regularly, learn about emerging ideas and developments that impact our field, a space for us to share our efforts, our stuckness, our opportunities with each other, with the openness to learn with and from one another. Today we have with us Anushka Ashok. She's a behavior science lead at Finalmile. Her work includes designing solutions around building trust for driving uptake of COVID-19 and HPV vaccines, driving engagement with financial literacy programs, and uptake of financial products, to name a few. She'll be sharing more about enabling trust using behavior science in the context of law and justice innovations. Over to you, Anushka.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to meet everyone. And it's so nice to have like such a diverse group of people together as well. My aim and effort on this call is to just give you an idea of a behavior science perspective to trust, and hope that it provides a framework for you to think about trust slightly differently, and also maybe think about how you might want to action on trust. And the idea is the fact that, of course, I can't give solutions given that there's such a diverse cohort, but the idea is if I'm able to provide a framework for thinking, that is the best place, the best thing that I could do for this diverse group. So my idea is the fact that all of you all mentioned a specific area of where you'd want to build trust. I want you to keep that in your head as an example. And as I'm talking, please make connections to what you're thinking about, right? It'll help you make those connections, learn better, and at the end of the call, hopefully have some sort of ideas that you might want to take forward. So through the call, I'm going to talk through some examples from my work on vaccine uptake, on uptake of financial services. I'm going to try and give an example from like the legal tech space, specifically on ODR, which I've kind of like built with Simi and Ayushi as well. But the idea is to kind of make it a little bit more collaborative, and I'll try and keep some time for questions as well, right? I'm just going to quickly share my screen. I hope everyone can see my screen clearly.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. And everyone can hear me as well, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the purpose of the talk, or the purpose of this discussion, is more around how might we use justice, how might we allow justice and law innovations to instill trust among their users, specifically from a behavior science perspective. And I thought I might want to start talking to you all a little bit about behavior science before I jump into the idea of trust, just so it can kind of have like a shared assumption about human behavior before we jump in. Okay, so bear with me for like just 2 minutes. So generally, behavior science as a discipline or as a practice draws from various scientific or academic disciplines that study how we make decisions, right? So I'm talking about behavioral economics, I'm talking about social psychology, I'm talking about cognitive and decision sciences that really help us understand how we decode, how we think about decision making, how we make decisions, and how that determines our behavior, right? And how I can use that understanding to see how to impact various programs that Ayushi mentioned I worked on, whether it's vaccine uptake of products. So a lot of my work is about being a practitioner rather than an academic, right? So it's important to understand that the way we think decisions are made is very different from how actually decisions are made, right? So inherently, we have an assumption that people are rational beings, right? That people, when they're trying to make a decision, kind of think through their options and then make a decision. And therefore, a lot of us who are product owners think a lot about how we might have to drive awareness in a user. And once they know, they will definitely do. And once they do once, they will definitely do again, right? But the problem or the flaw in this idea is the fact that behavior science tells us that a lot of our decisions and our behavior are actually impacted by a lot of non-conscious factors or invisible factors, right? And therefore, we're not so quote unquote rational as we earlier thought, but more there are certain bounds or limitations to our rationality. And that doesn't mean that's a bad thing. I think it's we're ecologically evolved as species to ensure that we're able to go about our lives. And therefore, it's just about accounting for those limitations when we're designing products and services, right? So one of my best quotes that I love to quote is by Antonio Damasio, who's a neuroscientist, who mentioned that we are not thinking beings that feel, but feeling beings that think, right? So what am I saying? I'm saying basically we're emotional beings. A lot of our decisions are actually driven by our emotions. They're very intuitive. They're just poised towards action rather than thinking beings that we earlier assumed. And therefore, when we're making decisions, 95% of our decisions are driven by factors that are non-conscious to us, driven by our emotions, driven by these heuristics or decision shortcuts, and they're very dependent in the context in which we're making a decision or behavior, right? And this is an important background when I start telling you a little bit about trust as well, because the inherent assumption is the fact that even when we're thinking about trust judgments, there's sometimes intuitive judgments about trust, right? So for example, if I'm thinking about pushing vaccines to ensure that everyone is taking their COVID vaccine or HPV vaccines, while there's historic trust built from a health system point of view, one negative case on WhatsApp about a kid that got fever or got adverse events changes all the perceptions about trust in a minute, right? Because that's how trust works, right? And that's how we as human beings make decisions as well. So now I'm going to jump back to the real topic, which is around trust, right? And I'm going to start off with a quick definition, because I think it's helpful to ground ourselves in an understanding of what does trust mean, because we use the word so much that sometimes we might not know where it actually comes from. There are multiple definitions of trust, but I'm going to start with this one, right? Because I think it holds all the components. So when we talk about trust, it's a complex psychological and social phenomena that involves the willingness of an individual, that is the truster, to be vulnerable or dependent to another party, which is the trustee, in a situation where there is uncertainty or perceived risk. It's based on a positive expectation and belief that the trustee will act in a reliable, competent, benevolent manner, and their actions or decisions will align to the best interests of the trustee. And I don't mean to just read this definition out to you. I want to highlight a couple of points, right? So there's obviously an interaction happening between the truster and the trustee, where the trustee is in a vulnerable position, given that they're in a situation of perceived risk or uncertainty. So in those situations, it becomes more important to have trust judgments. And now the truster has positive expectations or beliefs about the actions of the trustee, right? And that they will act in the best interest. So this is inherently what trust actually means, right? And now we were thinking about how do we actually build trust. But before that, I want to go into a little bit of detail about those aspects that I did mention to you and why trust is important, right? So number one, I think there are 4 distinct aspects or components to understand. So the first thing about trust is the fact that there's an evolutionary basis for our trust, right? It's basically evolved because of the fact that for our survival, the social bonds and alliances are obviously helping us survive. And therefore, trust becomes that adaptive mechanism to promote the cooperation and cohesion, which is why you need to be able to be vulnerable in front of someone else and assume that they will be benevolent to us. And that's held some sort of evolutionary gain, which is why we continue to have trust, and it's very important to understand. Number 2, there's a psychological aspect to trust, right? Where trust is about that subjective perception as an individual or someone who is a truster, that I feel whether I should be trusting someone else. It's psychologically, emotionally felt by the individual. The third part that I mentioned, it's a relational judgment as well, right? Because it is a relationship between 2 people or a person and an entity. And therefore, you're making a judgment whether I should be trusting. And this relational dimension is important because sometimes it's forgotten. And the last one is that the judgment of trust is always sometimes influenced by the normative ideas of who should I be trusting or who should I not be trusting, right? And the normative ideas that it comes from, norms from my society, from people around me, from my reference group, which is also important to understand, right? So these are some important dimensions that I'm going to pick as I'm going about our conversation overall. And now, before I get into talking about trust within the legal tech domain, I want to give you some examples of certain ideas about trust that I've gotten from my multiple projects that I've worked on. So number one, in any of these complex behavior problems that I generally do work on, fundamentally, one aspect that I've always had to understand is the idea of trust, right? Because a lot of the situations work under these complex contexts where there's risk and uncertainty, and you have to check whether the person is happy to be vulnerable to another entity or organization. So when I was working on financial inclusion, trust becomes a very, very important determinant, right? Because what I've seen is the fact that a lot of the underserved populations interact more with informal finance services versus formal finance services. Now, the reason why they interact with informal finance services is the idea that they trust it more. And where does trust come from? Trust comes from that social relationship that they do have with people, that familiarity that they do have with people. The fact that if I'm taking a loan from someone, they're definitely going to pay it back because we are bound by a social network versus just a transactional network, right? So I'm just saying that those were these important kind of like factors that determine trust, and it might not be competence or expertise, but it was basically familiarity and that relationship that I did have with an individual. Where formal financial products, because there wasn't that level of trust, which actually came from the idea that even though they might be an expert, there's no certainty that I'm going to get my money. And how do I know that there's no physicality to it in some way that they're going to be accountable to me for some reason, right? And I'm just trying to give you some examples to kind of get us to think a little bit about the various dimensions that actually impact trust. Similarly, when I was working with digital financial services, you actually understand that one situation of fraud makes you think completely different about any interactions on digital finance. Even if it's the fact that on Google Pay, I've seen fraud, I might not use online banking because I equally transfer my fraud mental model onto digital banking because it all comes under the idea of like digital finance. Similarly with health, right? One big point that I want to make is any sort of health seeking behavior that I'm working, and I generally work in public health, not in private health. It's all about how they trust the system, right? Any sort of health seeking behavior, whether it's maternal, child health, immunization, etc. Therefore, it's very important to understand the nuance of trust. And what's important to understand is that COVID gave the health system almost a wake-up call in terms of why they need to focus on building trust, right? Because with the COVID vaccine, you saw, even with the fact that the vaccine was available to a lot of people, there was a lot of pushback to uptake because of inherent distrust, right? Distrust of the vaccine, number one, saying that it's not for me. Distrust for the health system to not be able to be handled in the health crisis. Distrust to the government. Now, it's important to understand, even though the government in COVID did not serve the purpose and did not provide, that rubbed off on the vaccine as well. So I'm just trying to help you understand the fact that even though you might be trying to drive trust in one specific behavior or one specific touch point, it's influenced by the macro context in which it exists within, right? And therefore, what's really important in public health systems right now is to say it's important to invest in trust building, not only for vaccines, but overall, because that's what's going to help in resilient and sustained demand. Right? So we have to invest more in building trust, because only then people will continue to demand for all sorts of services. And that's when it's sustained even in times of crisis like a pandemic as well. Right? So I think someone mentioned the point about like intrinsically driven to use a product. So that's why trust is important, because it gives you like that sustained need to continue to use that product as well. It sustains that usage. Number three, we also worked a lot with organizational health because, of course, that inherent judgment of trust influences engagement, culture, leadership, effectiveness. And it's fundamentally about how you can trust the entity or the organization. And we did a lot of work to build trust. And the last is with misinformation, right? And I think misinformation exists above finance and health because it's permeated everywhere. But basically, how do people assess trustworthiness of information is also important. And you might see in a WhatsApp message where you know the reason why a WhatsApp message works well to communicate information, because it's emotionally vivid. Number two, because it seems to have come from some sort of expert, and the sender, the person who sent the WhatsApp message to you, might be someone who they consider as credible, and therefore the information is also credible. So the sender is as important as the content of the message. And within the content of a message, it's easy to misuse the markers of trustworthiness in order to kind of like generate that kind of advantage. And guys, the reason why I wanted to tell you these examples, because I feel examples are more vivid to illustrate points. So I hope even from those points, you're able to kind of understand a couple of elements of trust, right? That they don't have to be about expertise, competence, and fairness. They also can be about familiarity, just the fact that you can physicality. Those are also markers of trustworthiness. Secondly, the fact that trust exists within larger contexts, and you can't decouple the specific product or service from the larger context in which they're interacting with. And in the case of digital tech, you have to understand the context of technology and how they might have certain barriers to technology or assumptions of technology that will rub off on your product as well. right? So these are just some quick takeaways. And before I get into the crux of what I wanted to mention to you today, I wanted to talk a little bit about this very important concept that I think is important to mention, right? A lot of people in the introduction, we talked about trust, we talked about trust deficit. I mentioned the word distrust as well, right? And usually, right, when people think about trust, we always think about distrust as the opposite end of a spectrum, right? Person's trust or a person is distrusting. But actually, if you read a lot of literature about trust, we basically see that they don't actually exist on opposite ends of the same spectrum, but it's actually two different spectrums, right? And I'll tell you why. So generally, when you think about trust, like I did mention to you, it's about the positive expectations you do have about the other entity, right? But when I'm talking about distrust, it's actually about you having negative expectations about the conduct of another person, right? So therefore, one is positive expectations, and low positive expectations equals low trust versus distrust, right? And having low negative expectations is not equal to trust, it's actually equal to low distrust. And this is again an important model for us to think about, right? Because when you think about it, if you have a person who might be trusting you a lot, and for some reason there's reduction in trust, what you might need to do to get them back to high trusting is very different than you would do for someone who's distrustful of your product overall, right? So let me kind of give you an example from maybe like the ODR context. So one aspect that might be a good marker for trust for people or building trust might be an association to Lok Adalats, right? Or some sort of body that they're able to take that trust from. An aspect of low trust might basically be another example where, an example of distrust might be where a person has had a bad experience with ODR and basically felt that it was unfair or biased towards an individual, and therefore they believe ODR is actually negative. It has negative expectations of the outcome of that particular thing, right? So I just want to make sure that even when we're thinking about people and we're thinking about problems, it's important to kind of understand high trust versus distrust, right? And the example about, I think, low trust that we had come up with is the fact that there might be a lack of physicality to an ODR, and that might be creating low trust, but that doesn't necessarily create distrust in ODR, right? So that's how we can kind of think about it. So again, this is a small framework for you to think about when you think about increasing trust, when you think about decreasing distrust, what are the different things that you might have to do overall? And now the whole conversation that I'm going to take is not going to talk a lot about distrust, because that's another conversation, but I'm going to focus more on the idea of trust, right? And what we can actually do to action trust. Because I think the issue that I've always seen is the fact that if I'm talking to people from the legal tech domain, from a financial domain, from a health domain, everyone says trust is the problem. But the issue is that people are not able to action that problem, right? The fact is, okay, there is low trust, but what do I need to do about it is something that's hard, right? Because we always think about trust as a quality that is inside of an individual, right? That's intrapsychic. It's inside of the individual and based on the perceptions that I have about an external entity, right? And therefore, of course, you can make some changes, but it's more dependent on how you're supposed to impact the perceptions of the individual. It's not giving you a sense of how you can leverage it. And when you're thinking about trust, and when you go back to the definition and the aspects of trust that I did talk to you about, I kept mentioning the fact that trust is inherently relational, right? It's between two people, right? And therefore that feeling doesn't have to be an actual experience. It could be like a perceived experience of my interaction or what I've heard from another person's interaction, but it's inherently relational. And the idea of it being relational is actually a good thing, because now we can think about how do we actually impact this interaction overall, right? How do we actually think about not focusing on what the individual has, which is important and will have to improve, but also what are the specific markers or signals of trustworthiness should the interaction or should the person who's the trustee need to send out for a person to inherently think about that person as trustworthy, right? So again, the point I'm trying to make is when we talk about trust, we always talk about it as a psychological component within the individual. And therefore, it's harder to impact and it's harder for us as practitioners or as implementers or innovators to change that trust very soon. But if we think about it as an interaction, and we need to think about me as an actor who's trying to get a person to trust me, what are the signals that I am sending out, right? That is going to make a person believe that I am trustworthy, right? Or what is happening in the interaction when I'm using the surface, when I'm hearing about the surface, that really cues those ideas of trustworthiness that I might be thinking about. So I'm going to pause for a second, and I know I've spoken, and I want to pause and see if anyone has any questions, any ideas, any clarifications, or if it's making sense, then I can kind of like continue as well.
Yeah, I can ask a question. I was really interested in the way you separated the continuum, how trust and distrust don't really fall on the same scale. It's low trust to high trust, and then high distrust to low distrust. Could you maybe give an example of how this applies to a situation?
Sure. So, and maybe I gave an ODR example, but I can maybe talk about like a COVID example, because all of us had experienced COVID and thought about the vaccine as well. So when we were doing the COVID project overall, we basically realized that there are different personas or groups of people in terms of their barriers. So one group that we saw, which was high uptake towards the COVID vaccine, was basically because they had very, very high institutional trust. They always went to the health system. They really trusted their providers, right? So because they trusted their providers, they trusted the health system, they trusted the vaccine, they trust other vaccines, so they trust this vaccine as well. So that's a high trust situation. Now, there were a certain bunch of people that earlier trusted the health system a lot, but because of COVID and their interactions with COVID and these conspiracy theories about COVID, their trust decreased, right? They were like, I don't understand how my health system has changed so much. I've been taking vaccines, but now I'm not sure if I should. So they still expected positive of the health system, but because of this particular situation, they had less positive expectations about the health system, right? So over here, so this is quite different from the people who are high trust, right? And there were another bunch of people who specifically had negative assumptions about the health system and about the vaccine. They basically said that the health system is after us. They're trying to purposely push vaccines on me, right? So their expectation was the fact that they had negative expectations about the health system, right? So how I would action or think about a solution for these different groups is different. A person who was low trust, it was the fact that, okay, fine, COVID created a disruption, but think about all your past behavior about vaccination, about going to the health facility, and think about all the doctors. If you trust them, you should take the vaccine. So we said, let's use their local doctors or their family doctors to reinstate the trust and them to get the vaccine. So that's low trust. But when I was thinking about distrust, right, or high distrust, over there, you can't tell them that, oh, the health system is good actually, because they have negative assumptions of them. So over there, we needed to think about how can people from within their network or within their circle of influence, right, convince them versus having an actor from the health system, right? So again, think about it. What I did was I tried to understand trust and how it manifested in different groups of people. And based on my understanding of a distrust versus a low trust, I'm able to action or think about solutions differently as well. I hope that helped as an example, Aishi.
Thank you.
And guys, I hope it's making sense. I know it's a lot of information and I tried to give it in a short way, but please let me know if there's anything that I need to kind of go about, or I could continue.
Yeah, maybe we could continue.
Sure. So the point that I left off was talking a little bit about the idea that how do we think about a framework for trust that doesn't only think about perceptions of the person that needs to trust, but also about thinking about the interaction and thinking also about the trustee, the person who is supposed to be trusted. What are the markers that they can give out? What are the signals that they can give out? So we're able to almost impact the judgment of trust overall, right? So that's exactly a small, very, very basic framework that we did create. So we see this framework, right? It's very basic. The idea is that the framework helps you understand from a behavioral perspective how the context and mental models of the truster, who's the person who's thinking about making a trust judgment, how do you kind of understand where trust comes from? And it also takes into account the fact that because it's relational, how can I actually influence the trust perception by uncovering the markers that the trustee, which is the person or the entity that's supposed to be trusted, and the interaction allows to signal this trustworthiness judgments overall, right? So the idea is what this framework does, number one, it tells you how to think about trust. Number two, it tells you about, as a trustee and from the situation, how can I actually get certain markers of trust that work for the product or the service that exists? And number two, it might help you think about levers about how might I signal that trustworthiness to make sure the person is going to trust me, right? Because again, we can't assume that just because a product has transparency and fairness, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's perceived by the individual, right? And therefore, it's all about how should it be signaled so the truster makes that judgment to trust a particular individual. And again, I know it sounds conceptual, so maybe I can start by giving you a small example overall, right? So we had done a project on financial inclusion within which we work with account aggregators, which is basically the idea of two financial entities sharing data to ensure that it's easier for people to get loans who are financially excluded. So it's a digital product and it's basically for sharing data. So now when you think about it, right, we said that how do I actually understand, do they inherently trust this? Because if they trust this, then they will engage. If they are not trusting of this, they won't engage. So what is the context, right? So the context is a financial context, and it's a context where there's like a digital product or there's a digital service that I need to use that's going to share my data in order for me to get a loan more easily, right? So now this inherently is a decision in which there is a risk, right? Because I don't know what's going to happen. There's a sense of uncertainty, there's ambiguity because it's also online. And therefore over here, these are the situations in which I really need to default to a trust judgment because I don't know what I'm supposed to do. It's also a new product, so I don't have any normative idea of should I be doing it, should I be not. I don't know if other people are doing it. In most cases, I've not seen anyone use it. So in cases, that's actually reducing my trust overall. Now, as an individual or a truster, it's not about how I think about this project or logically what are the benefits, but how I feel about it, right? And when I'm thinking about how I feel about this financial account aggregator, I'm immediately thinking not only about finance and the idea that I don't have too much money, I'm anyway scared to lose any money, I really need my loan, but also the idea that what do I think about digital and what do I think about digital finance? So generally, all I know about digital finance is the fact that I've heard a lot of stories about UPI and fraud. So maybe this would also create some sort of fraud if I use it, right? So see what the person is doing. They're kind of like getting mental models of technology, of digitization, of digital fraud into the idea of this online platform, right? The other thing is I'll always, as a person, think about it in terms of a trust judgment of some other action that I could have been doing. So the person's like, instead of sharing data on this online account aggregator platform that shares data to get a loan more easily, I could have easily gone to a bank and given it to someone, and the bank manager would have done this, right? So you're always thinking about my trust judgment in relation to what I could have otherwise used as well, right? So here I'm comparing it between physically going to a bank and over here doing it online, right? So this is how me as a truster, I'm perceiving it. But now, me as an account aggregator platform, I'm thinking about how should I, as a trustee or an entity, signal to the individual that they should be trusting me, right? Because they don't know anything about me, right? So one thing that I could definitely signal is the fact that I have, like, even though you might not know me, I am partnering with the RBI and I have a lot of other banks who work with me closely and who have partnered with me, right? So expertise through association, because I don't have it right now. The second is I could talk a lot about the idea of efficiency. You don't have to go all the way to a bank. You're immediately going to share these documents, which is easier for you to do. You don't have to go through paperwork. The third one is a mutual benefit, to basically say that if you do this, you might be able to get a better interest on your loan, right? So again, I'm trying to cue certain things for you to be able to make a trust judgment or view me as more trustworthy, right? And the second part is, how do I actually deliver on this, right? Because even in my interaction with you, even when I'm going through the process, how are you giving me certain markers for me to continue to engage and think about you as trustworthy? So over here, as a platform, it's very efficient. There's transparency about steps, about who's going to see your data, who's not going to see your data. There is consistency in terms of the service that is going to be given to you, the fact that you can take away your documents really soon. There is a grievance redressal system, right? So I know that these are critical markers of trustworthiness. And I know that these are things that are important to an individual. So anytime they're interacting with me, these are some of the markers of trustworthiness that through my product design, through my framing, through my messaging, I need to constantly reinforce for the person to trust me inherently, right? And the reason for them to trust me is because I'm giving them this information, or I'm cueing trustworthiness overall, right? So I'm going to pause and I'm going to see if that's making sense. But what I thought I would do is give an example from like a legal tech domain, specifically ODRs. But again, I know that maybe you can kind of like think about how it might connect to some things that y'all are doing. So again, guys, this framework is just for y'all to think about you as an entity or you as a service. How are you cueing trustworthiness, right? What are those cues? And even if I give you a cue such as transparency, that's the first step. The second step is to say, how do I showcase that transparency in the way my product is designed, in which the way in which I communicate my messaging to you, the way in which you're interacting with my people as well, right? So this is just giving you the levers for you to understand what I need to action and where, right? And the idea is that you need to signal it versus just assume that the person is going to make a judgment based on all the information that you throw at them, right? So similarly for ODRs, I want to pause and see if anyone has questions, or I can jump to the example. Yes, Brinda.
So just thinking from a context that I am working in, right? So when we think about building trust, I think we conducted one of our studies, field studies, and there were like a group of women who asked us, what do you get in return for providing this service to us, like this product, right? And that was very difficult to convince to them that, we're an NGO and, we're a trust. We don't have any profit coming out of this. So, this is how. So I think that may be another element to add to this factor, that we can also be transparent about, what are we getting out of this particular transaction of trust that we're trying to build.
And I think, Brinda, that's a very, very important point, right? And it's an important point because, like you said, like it's actually not benefit, but mutual benefit. Because at some point, if you're thinking about an interaction, they're also thinking about the fact that you might be doing this because you want to do it. But then, like, is there an ulterior motive in your head, right? So there are 2 points that contribute to it. What is the benefit that is mutual? But secondly, what is transparent? Like, is there transparency in the process, and is there fairness? And one point that I do want to make overall is the fact that the markers that I've put out over here are markers that are relevant to the context of an account aggregator framework, right? An important point to think about is the fact that the markers of trustworthiness are different for different products and services, right? Because of the fact that you almost have to think about a fit between markers of trustworthiness and what your product, service, or entity or an individual can serve or do, right? So for example, a marker of trustworthiness for a court might be the physicality, the tangibility of it, the fact that it's been around for so long, the fact that all judgments are enforceable. But that might not be the markers of trustworthiness for an ODR platform, because it's a different platform, right? So the markers of trustworthiness over there come from the idea that there is transparency, there are feedback loops built into it, there is neutrality overall. So again, an important point to understand is that I've not given a drop-down list of all the markers of trustworthiness, right? I could do that. It could be a long list. But the idea is that everyone can't do everything, right? Because there has to be a fit between me as an entity saying, what can I signal out, right? What can I signal out in terms of my promise? And what can I signal out in terms of my process, or when we are interacting with the end user, or when they're interacting with my service as well. Any other questions? Okay, maybe I can go ahead with this example because I think this is a lot more relevant to everyone over here. And then we can kind of like go through questions again, right? So I kind of did this as like a thought experiment where I was thinking a little bit about when we're thinking about ODRs or quotes, how do we kind of like think about the idea of trust? Again, this is based on my own assumptions, but I'd like to build it out if y'all could give me some examples or tidbits about what you all have done as well. Right. But I'm going to start us off with this. Right. So the idea is the fact that when you're thinking about the context, right, where a person is trying to make a decision between an ODR or going to a court, right, the context is rooted in a very similar context of high risk, uncertainty and ambiguity, right? Because obviously I don't know what to do. I don't have enough information. I know that it's a risky decision that I have to think a little bit about and not just jump to it. And therefore I'm relying on my emotions. Of course, over here, because of the fact that there might be certain options that are more normative, because maybe courts might have social proof, it might have been there a longer time, that could be one aspect that might push me towards trusting one option over the other. But basically, it's a situation of uncertainty. Me as an individual who's a truster, basically is trying to think about what do I think about these particular options, right? Who do I trust better to be able to deal with my case? So like I said, I default to some of my mental models, right? I might think a little bit about which one is physical that I can trust. And if something goes bad, I can go to. I think a little bit about the fact that, okay, one might be digital. What do I think about digital products? What do I think about my constraints with interacting with digital? That might impact my trust judgment as well. And then also my two options, right? How do I think about them in relative terms? I know we think about a product in isolation, but they're always making decisions between the competitive sets, right? So let's think firstly about quotes. What are those markers of trustworthiness that quotes inherently have and have been literally signaling, right? So the thing with quotes are, it is normative, right? Because of the fact that they signal, the context is that of authority. The context is that of anytime you have a case, you go there. Everyone, when they have a case, you go to a court, right? So that is the default. That is literally what social proof is going to drive you towards in terms of a trust judgment. Now, what is the factors of a trustee? What is the court signaling? They're signaling power. They're signaling expertise. They have a physicality and tangibility to it. There's a sense of integrity because they've been dealing with so many cases for so long. And there's a sense of consistency, right? Because it's been there for so long. Now, in your interactions with the court as well, you basically see that you believe inherently that it might be a fair process because that's what it's told to you, right? It's going to be a fair process. You know that there's enforceability to whatever outcome that comes out of it. There is due process that is followed. And there's a sense of, again, tangibility is a very, very big hook for people because they feel if something goes wrong, I have to go to someone to say, which is not there in the opposite. Now, if I go to ODRs, right, I'm going to give you a couple, but I want to ask y'all because y'all have been building ODRs and have been thinking about this problem, right? So from a context point of view, ODRs seem to have a little bit of novelty, right? It's new. So from a context factor, there is that novelty that's impacting my trust judgment a little bit because I'm like, I don't know too much about this, right? Secondly, in terms of what an ODR needs to signal out as an entity is the fact that number one, we were discussing that maybe it's the reputation or the competence actually comes from linking with something that already has trust. So you're borrowing trust from something that exists, right? That might be a lok adalat, it might be a linkage to a particular bank, it might be a referral from like some sort of organization, and therefore that logo is really important because that basically says that I'm building because I'm linked to this other one. Secondly, it could be competence on talking about degrees, talking about certain things. And the thing that I think everyone has to signal out with OER is the idea of efficiency. The fact that you're going to get your case tried in a much faster way. It will be done sooner as well. That's what you're signaling out. Now, in terms of the interaction, the markers of trustworthiness are actually around convenience, efficiency, quick issue resolution, transparency of the process, constant feedback loops and empathy, right? So again, what I've done over here is I've pulled out certain markers of trustworthiness that signal trustworthiness to me as an individual that I believe interact with what an ODR also has and can deliver. And the second part of the problem is to say, how do I signal this well at the right time for people to make a judgment that I am trustworthy. So one thing that's important to understand is that in courts, there's not as much of an interaction or a process that really instills that idea of trustworthiness. It's coming more from the authority of the trustee, right? But with ODR, you actually see a lot of it comes from the process, the experience, the interactions, which is very important. And therefore, a lot of what the trustworthiness factors of the trustee or the entity is kind of borrowed right now, because it's not been around for too long, from other organizations that the end user sees as trustworthy, right? So again, these are some examples that I've taken from my basic reading of what Simi and Ayush have kind of shared with me. But I wanted to pause and kind of like understand a little bit about like what are some of those factors of trustworthiness that you think would also be important. And again, the point is that maybe we're not using this as yet, or maybe we are using it. We just have to think a little bit about how we need to signal it better for people to start using. So any more ideas about certain markers of trustworthiness that an ODR platform could use?
I have a question, which is maybe partly relevant to ODR, but also links a bit to courts. Is if you say, for example, with ODR, the marker relates more to processes, right? You know, that's your strength. What I heard you subtly say is lean into that, you know, to signal that more. I'm guessing as much as it's signaling, it's also obviously the assumption is you're being that, and because you're being that, you signal it. Is there merit, for example, if you're an ODR provider? Because in a way, what you also said, when you do by association to Lok Adalat or something, you are also somewhere signaling authority. Like, is markers of trust to also lean into dimensions that are not your strength? So, for example, if the court wants to earn trust, to not come from an authoritative place, but to come from a place where it's trying to sort of come in a different, and would that be a thing that could help generate trust, or would that be a kind of really long-winded way, because a mental model for citizens is anyway so far and it doesn't make sense? So for example, I'm thinking in a court context, rather than just saying mandating everybody should do this, which is a position of authority, to kind of say, I give you a choice, or you opt in, or whatever, right? So I mean, that's an example of what it's not so much what is the marker as much as I'm trying to think, what do I do to get it? So I'm just trying to ask, how often does it make sense to kind of know what your strength, I mean, to know that this is not your strength, or this is where you kind of completely lack, and kind of lean into that to generate trust versus doubling down on what you think may already be your advantage?
Very important question, right, Supriya? And I think the idea is that when people think about a process of the fact that, okay, they have a case that they need to try a certain type of case, what is table stakes assumption of trust for them? That's one question, right? Maybe for them, table stakes might be a couple of things. It might be physicality, it might be reputation, it might be authority, right? And then and that's one part of the equation. The second part of the equation is you as an entity that is an ODR or a court, what are you best at signaling in terms of a marker of trustworthiness, right? These are two assumptions. But the idea that these need to be kind of like overlapping, right? So number one, you need to signal what you're good at doing. Because one thing about trust, right, is the fact that you can't signal something that you're not, right? So you can't say, trust me, I'm an authority, because you're like, you're not an authority, which is why you're borrowing authority, right? So you need to know what you're good at and what you need to do. But when I made the first point about table stakes, right, because courts have been around for so long, they have created certain mental models of what they believe is inherently trustworthy, right? And therefore, it's not to say an ODR needs to do it, but how can an ODR, if it's not a marker, partner with something that kind of brings it until you're able to kind of like generate a mental model of its own, right? So which is why I'm saying right now, as an entity, maybe ODR doesn't have too much to signal, but it's still important for a person to kind of like think about this as an authority. Therefore, how can I borrow, right, in a certain way? But I know I'm really strong in process, I'm really strong in benefit, I'm really strong in transparency. How do I make sure it exists in the process, number one? But also, how do I make sure I'm really emanating it, right? Because that assumption, again, as product builders, as human beings, is the fact that, you know, like if it's good, people should use it and know it's good. But in many cases, that's not true, right? Because a lot of how you interact with a product is your perceptions about that product as well. So you don't only have to do it, you have to do it, but you also need to signal and mention why it's there. And that's through like visuals, reinforce, like it's not just a feedback loop, but to basically say that, look, we've kind of like told you about this. So reinforce that perception as well, that it's such an efficient process, it's so convenient, it's so quick, right? So I think Supriya made a good point. There's certain things that are basic that you might want to borrow from if you understand it is, which is why reputation is, I didn't say like it's authority and expertise, because that might be built over time. But it's important to understand reputation as a marker, because I'm borrowing from an entity that already does have it, right? So I hope that kind of like answers, but a very important point that you did bring up. And actually, I want to make one point as well, and I know we're almost at time, but just the idea that you might have multiple markers of trust, right? But it's important to understand that trust is actually very dynamic and it evolves, right? And it unfolds through experience, through interactions, through interplay of various factors, through contextual changes as well. And therefore, you need to think about when you have to showcase each marker of trust, right? So for example, Supriya, to your point, the marker of trust about expertise may be table stakes for you to start judging a person or judging an entity as I'm going to start using it. But when you're trying to maintain trust, it's about reinforcing that process of transparency, of feedback loops, of convenience, right? And therefore, if there's a disruption of trust, right, because maybe, I don't know, there's like a data breach, or in certain cases, an ODR judgment is not enforced, or there's some law that says it's not enforceable, there's a disruption. So now what do you need to do to regain the trust? What are the markers that you need to use to kind of like regain and think about the trust? Because the problem or the issue that the health system has done is they assumed people trust us and we can do anything. But then in the disruption of trust, such as COVID, you realize that all my systems are broken, right? And now I really need to do so much to very intentionally build it. So therefore, think about also on a journey, where do the markers of trust that you as a product can hold show up in different places? And I know we're at time and I'm very cognizant of that. So I'm just going to pause and see if there are any questions, or I could share the deck and we could do questions later on as well, because I know it's a lot of information.
Yeah, I think personally, Anushka, this has given a mental model. I think the trust and distrust being completely new, different spectrums was an important one, at least personally for me. And I think it comes down to really like, seeing how do you first discover these are the mental models of the communities you're working with before you even jump to what is a marker or not. Because often very times it's only in conversation that it's revealed, like the question that Brinda asked, like, but what is in it for you, which is very often asked to a lot of us, like you must have a vested interest, and these are things that throw you off because you're not even thinking about that being relevant. So I think the role that we have to play in surfacing the mental models that exist and really paying attention to them is, I think, of paramount importance as I'm hearing you, because sometimes we very quickly jump into the solutioning versus understanding really where people are and what they the biases and the not just of your work but the larger environment and everything that kind of comes through. But I think in this really comes down to, and I'm sharing this for the entire group because we've had the benefit of jamming a bit with Anushka on some very real problems that we are facing, like at a much more micro level. And just, I think the segmentation as a result of it really helps, like to break down people into groups, not to kind of see them all into one, has been profoundly useful in thinking about what does it mean for the design of the solutions. And it's seemingly small. What I like the elegance of it is often that it's not some drastically expensive thing to do. It is often a very elegant and simple thing that we all can kind of take away. So it's just an invitation, that this is something that we can, maybe if we put a particular problem on the table and kind of jump on it, it might also be a interesting one for us to kind of, this has been a very useful like framework. Without this, it would have been harder to jump into the detail. But if anyone in the group has a particular problem statement that they want to take on and say, okay, but what would it mean here and now, it might be an interesting thing for all of us to to work on. So please reach out to us if you think you'd like to use this platform for that. It can be a good jamming session.
Here's a thought. Sorry, I know we're beyond time, but just something. I mean, I've got a lot from this. But in the mediation process, you're asking people who intrinsically sort of distrust each other, don't trust each other, to actually work together to build a platform of trust, to rely on what the other's saying for its worth, and all of that. And so for me, this it's not about pitching something that's external to the person, but really making them sort of, how do I put it, to move from a position of mistrust vis-a-vis each other to something of trust and then to collaboration. You know, a lot of questions for me there from what you're saying. I think I need to sort of take this in. I wanted to ask if your presentation could be shared.
Of course, of course. I can actually share a slightly longer format which has something written as well, so you could process it. But I think, Chitra, to your point, right? The idea that trust and distrust are on two different spectrums, the idea is that what reduces distrust doesn't create trust. So when you're thinking about mediation, it's about number one, reduce distrust. Then think about what can I also do to create trust between people, which might be two different things to do. Rather than saying that, okay, let me just reduce distrust and then by default the other. Because one is that you're reducing negative expectations about the other, and then you're saying, okay, how do I increase positive expectations now to inherently be trusting? But yeah, definitely we'll share the deck. And again, guys, I know it's a lot of information, so please let me know if you want to connect later to discuss more or just need some time to process and then get back to me.
Thank you.
Okay, any last thoughts, questions? Okay, thank you so much, Anushka, and thank you everyone for participating. Please feel free to connect with Anushka over email, LinkedIn to ask her questions directly. I'll also be sharing a recording of this session and her presentation. And hope to see you in the next Learning Circle. Thank you. Good evening.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much for this. Thank you.
Thanks, Anushka. Thanks, everyone.